My friends, I close on a note of hope. We are not lulled by the momentary calm of the sea or the somewhat clearer skies above. We know the turbulence that lies below and the storms that are beyond the horizon this year. But now the winds of change appear to be blowing more strongly than ever.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy's assassination is a memory etched onto the minds of most Americans. On this fateful day, the beacon of hope for the future was snuffed out. Over the decades, unanswered questions, tampered evidence, ulterior motives, and witness testimony surrounding the assassination has perpetuated conspiracy theories and alternative explanations that challenge the official narrative. Without order, chaos. Chaos uncovers itself when we don't know what we are looking at. Chaos is the unknown, filled with all possibilities. But, as some theories suggest, it is from chaos that order can be found.
There's always been doubt in authority, and there have always been authorities that have done doubtful things. We still doubt authority. We still believe that those at the top might not be doing the best things for us.
Something has happened in the motor station. Stand by, please.
They're doing the best things for them.
It is time to unravel the mysteries, find order in the chaos, and answer the unanswerable. This is Who Killed JFK? The Conspiracies. John Kennedy's ideology, given time, would have dictated the course of world history. Many theories as to why the president was assassinated have permeated throughout popular culture.
Every now and then, something will come along where somebody might try and make a change at the top. Then they might get taken out, which creates a whole new set of conspiracy theories.
Was it one shooter like the official Warren Commission investigation states? Was there more than one shooter? A lone wolf? Or an organized hit by the elites of America? Who, with what, and why? Is it a conspiracy?
Because we know we're not told the whole truth, we have to fill the vacuum occasionally if, there's a feeling that what's out there in the open isn't the whole story. So therefore you have to speculate. And you sometimes have to theorize.
Unfortunate incidents similar to those that accompanied UN Ambassador Adelaide Stevenson's visit do not occur on this trip.
Most of the people involved have passed away, leaving avenues of investigation dead in their tracks. Will there ever be justice?
The assassin's aim is deadly.
Throughout the decades, information that has come to light has shown a spotlight on the dark underbelly of American politics, pointing towards a sinister plot to end the life of the youngest ever president.
It was a grueling, hard-fought campaign in which Kennedy tirelessly brought his vision of a new frontier in government to the people of America.
November 22nd, 1963. The Zapruder film. Taken as a home movie by Abraham Zapruder to capture a glimpse of the president showing his appreciation for the people, the silent 8mm film unknowingly gave the world the best photographical evidence for understanding what happened that day.
We had, if you like, an event that, was normal. It was a parade, it was the president in an open-top car. You wouldn't do that these days, probably. People were lining the streets, they were out to see him. The official story says that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, was somebody who had a grudge against the president. He had certainly Marxist leanings. He, well, on the surface at least, appeared to resent what had happened in Cuba, which he blamed Kennedy for. So he took a gun and he went to one of the rooms in the Texas School Book Repository and basically shot Kennedy as the cars were going by. He was apprehended soon after. He murdered a police officer, Officer Tippit, while he was, well, allegedly on the run, and was then finally apprehended in a cinema. And so history says, that's it. There was one man, and it was a terrible thing, and now we don't need to worry. Except, of course, that Oswald was never able to give his testimony.
Oswald walks his last mile. His assailant moves in from the right.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Literally a day after being apprehended, although he always proclaimed his innocence, a man called Jack Ruby came out of the crowd at the back of a police station and murdered Oswald. He shot him dead there on the spot. So of course we never then knew what Oswald would have had to have said, but he, in the short statements we have from him, claimed that he was just a patsy and that in fact he had not murdered the president. From that day onwards, of course, the arguments have grown. And looking at the physics of where shots came from, looking at all the many different factions of people that might have wanted to have got rid of Kennedy, has led to an entire industry of people wondering, well, what really did happen that day?
One week later, the Warren Commission is formed. Inconsistencies between witness accounts, evidence, and the conclusion of the report, including loaded questioning, have led many to become skeptical of the findings. The Warren Commission's conclusion points the finger solely at one lone wolf, stating that there was no evidence he was part of a conspiracy.
Lyndon Johnson initiated the Warren Commission, so he hired Chief Justice Earl Warren to look into the Kennedy assassination, but not too much. And it's very clear from statements made by people involved in the Warren Commission that they were basically told to explain why it was a lone gunman. It wasn't a serious investigation. But then after, of course, investigations begin and strange facts start to come out, and especially after Robert Kennedy is gunned down, people begin to become more suspicious. They start to look back at it, and by the mid-1970s, especially after Watergate, where now you find that even the president can't be trusted. In the end, there was such a clamor for a new investigation that in 1979, a paper was produced by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They looked into not only the Kennedy assassination, but also Martin Luther King. And it was really, again, a little bit of a whitewash. But nonetheless, the opening that offered was that it did have to accept that there probably, and that's the word they use, probably, was a wider conspiracy, and it acknowledges the likelihood of more than one gunman being present.
The investigation that was meant to put the case to rest created more controversy. Although it no longer exists, the unpublished findings of the commission were initially sealed for 75 years, not the usual 30. If it was a whitewash, potential insiders wouldn't be alive to face justice. Once everyone is gone, the investigation can't be reopened. In 2014, CIA historian David Robarge had in fact discovered that CIA operatives were complicit in covering up and withholding information from the Warren Commission. Evidence that the CIA may have been in contact with Oswald prior to 1963 was covered up. as well as CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, implicating links between organized crime and the CIA, providing potential motive for the killing. Additionally, steps taken to protect the president on his motorcade route became suspicious. The Secret Service opted to inspect none of the vantage points from over 20,000 windows along the route.
The theories that there was more than one gunman, of course, are going to revolve around what was seen and heard on the day as much as what was seen in the film. The grassy knoll, a number of people claimed that they heard shots coming from over the fence. Some of them did try to testify this to the Warren Commission. Interestingly, the Warren Commission said they would only consider evidence from people at the grassy knoll if their evidence concurred that there was only the lone gunman, Oswald. Now, that immediately looks suspicious.
Since that fateful day, theories from the mysterious Umbrella Man to the account of Lyndon B. Johnson's alleged mistress have led many down a rabbit hole with voluminous ends.
There is a man with an umbrella who's standing looking a little bit odd. Some have wondered, did he fire one of the shots? Was there even a gun concealed as part of the umbrella? We're getting into James Bond stuff here, but nonetheless, things like that have happened in history, not impossible. But then you get the strange tramps. So there were 3 men who were dressed in tramps' clothing, except for one of them looked a little bit smarter than that. They were hovering around the fence where some of the shooters are claimed to have been, or at least one of them. Now, later on, people did find them, they did identify them, and although the belief of some was that they were CIA men, some have said, no, they actually really were tramps. There are many different characters who claim they were there on the day. Some, retrospectively, have gone out of their way to claim that they were actually shooting bullets. There was a man called James Files, claims he was one of the shooters.
The curious case of James Files, the second shooter who allegedly pulled the trigger on the headshot that ultimately delivered the fatal blow to the president. During an interview while in federal prison in 1994, the former member of U.S. Special Operations Forces in Laos said he had developed a disdain for Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. His admission implicates the highest form of cooperation between the organized criminal underworld and government agencies responsible for the president's safety. According to Files, the hit wasn't a secret. Even the NSA and Hoover were aware of the attempt to oust the leader of the free world. Infamous Chicago mob boss Tony Accardo sanctioned the assassination through his Chicago mob family. Sam Giancana was allegedly in charge of the operation, a shady personality with previous links to the Central Intelligence Agency, supposedly recruited as part of the assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. In keeping with his testimony, Files believes it happened because the men in suits wanted to stay in Southeast Asia. Air, Navy, and Army bases were being set up all over Southeast Asia. The trillion-dollar scheme pushed by the military-industrial complex worked towards a mass production of arms, ammunition, chemicals, tanks, planes, and warships. But Kennedy stood in their way. Many historians to this day claim that Kennedy had planned the start of troop withdrawal from the region. Although all hearsay, one piece of evidence that could link his claims is a package belonging to the other gunman, Nicoletti. In the supposed package, buried by the side of a road, lies potential proof of perpetrators, dates, and contracts of hundreds of unsolved cases, including the murder of the president. In 1994, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was quoted as having investigated Files' allegation and found it not to be credible.
There was another man, a Native American man called Loy Factor, who claims he was one of the gunmen. Now, interestingly, he did say, although his testimony has been disbelieved by many people, he did say one of his fellow shooters was, again, Mac Wallace, who some people have named in a number of inquiries. And years later, a thumbprint or a fingerprint found on one of the cardboard boxes in the building where the shots were being fired from did turn out, apparently, to be Mac Wallace's print. So, you know, Lloyd Factor's testimony is rather fascinating because although some think he was a fantasist to some degrees, there might have been a partial truth there.
Another circulated motive for the death of Kennedy was his actions in Cuba. A change of status quo to the military-industrial complex is a threat not to be taken lightly.
Fidel Castro was, of course, the leader of Cuba. He had set up a communist state so near to American soil. So that he did worry many Americans, and we'd come out of the McCarthy years where, you know, anything remotely communist-leaning was seen as a massive threat.
Tensions with Cuba grew in 1960. The communist state established new diplomatic relations with America's Cold War enemies, raising serious security concerns. To end the threat, President Eisenhower authorized a plan. By recruiting Cuban exiles, the CIA planned to infiltrate the country with the aim of causing a revolution, ultimately ending the Castro regime. Once he assumed office, Kennedy became doubtful the mission would remain covert. Looking to keep his plans secret, Kennedy ordered the CIA to find a new location for infiltration. Their new location? The Bay of Pigs. Plans faltered on the day of the invasion. Badly timed air support led to the annihilation of many Cuban exiles waiting on the beach for protection. Over 1,200 Cubans were thrown into prison. Many were shot, and few swam to safety.
But if you're a Cuban, nonetheless, that was an invasion, or an attempted invasion. And many Cubans were not happy at all with Kennedy.
The mission failed, leaving Castro in power for decades to come, while also enhancing the relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year.
There certainly would have been another faction there that would have wanted revenge against Kennedy. And Oswald, we are told, was a sympathizer towards the Cubans, although some say in the double agent idea, actually, he was anti-Cuba. But, you know, these are the arguments that go round and round. But nonetheless, his Cuba always seems to come up somewhere down the line. But the communist sort of society, of course, was the big enemy. And what's interesting is, had the Americans managed to blame the communists on the shooting of Kennedy, they could have actually triggered conflicts against the Soviet Union had they wanted to. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think there was a genuine concern that that could lead to a nuclear war. So actually, there are many signs that after the killing of Kennedy, any indications that it could have been to do with Cuba or the Soviet Union or any links there were played down, because nobody wanted anything that would lead to a nuclear conflict.
Threats of nuclear war were real.
In 1962, there had been what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's where it was discovered that the Soviets were storing missiles on the island of Cuba, which of course is very near to America. And when this became public, that was a very dangerous moment in our history. Kennedy had to decide, did he bomb those missile sites? Did he threaten the Soviets? Would they retreat? Would they take the missiles away? So it was, you know, a time when probably we got the closest to nuclear conflict that we ever had. Now, in the end, what Kennedy did was say to the Soviets, right, we're going to put Cuba into quarantine. If you try and bring any more missiles into Cuba, we will board your ships. And there was one boarding of a Soviet ship. But luckily, the Soviet president, Nikita Khrushchev, he, I think, could see that this was very dangerous. He pulled back. And he did a deal with Kennedy that if he removed the missiles from Cuba, that Kennedy would promise not to invade. And that's something which I think then did lead to the peace that then followed. But some people felt Kennedy had sold out.
Kennedy's strong will to take action on what he felt was necessary for the betterment of the United States repulsed many of the powers that be.
To the military-industrial complex, it's big money, it's big business. And Kennedy, we like to believe anyway, perhaps was taking a moral stance on that. But certainly, yes, things changed when we got to Johnson and more warlike ways took over again.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. As long as we fulfill our functions at a time of climax in the struggle for freedom, then I believe it is the business of the President of the United States to concern himself with the general welfare and the public interest. And if the people feel that it is not, then they should secure the services of a new President of the United States.
President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please.
He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man... That's all right, sir. You waved, sir. As he was waving back, he was... The shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat, and his wife reached up toward him, and as he was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down.
To point the finger at one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, seems, at face value, believable, especially when you delve into his background.
Oswald had been a US Marine, and not a bad Marine, although that said he was court-martialed twice. He accidentally shot himself in the elbow on one occasion. He was fond of guns. He got to the position of marksman, which is not the best shooters, but, you know, not bad shooters. But then he left the Marines, and afterwards he went to live in the Soviet Union. He became a defector, or at least that's what we're told. Many believe that in fact he was a double agent, and that the defection was a setup, and that in fact all along he was working probably for the CIA. But nonetheless, he went to live in Russia. He and his wife Marina weren't happy there, and eventually they came back to the United States. And that's when he began to sort of get very concerned about what was going on in Cuba, and would give out leaflets on the streets complaining about the way the Cubans were being treated. Kennedy had become somebody that stood for everything that he didn't. And officially, at least, we're told that, you know, he just wanted to see this figure taken down, and so began his plot to kill him. However, as with all good conspiracies, that there are always other sides to this. And in fact, some say if you look at the people that Oswald was hanging out with, actually they were anti-Cuban. And that some believed that he used the pro-Cuban sort of, you know, the look of what he was doing as a cover. And that's when you get more into the double agent stuff. Somebody calling themselves Oswald went to Mexico City to either pick up communications or orders from the Soviets, apparently. And yet there are claims that some of the recordings made of Oswald's voice then, when he went to Mexico, were in fact faked, and that they were an actor. And actually there are people in the intelligence services that have backed that up. We know Oswald owned a gun, and there is a famous photograph of Oswald holding this gun, which Some people say it's a fake. Now, his wife, Marina, after the shooting, claimed that she did take, the photograph of him holding the gun. But others have said it looks, if you look at the picture, like it's faked. Again, you then get into, well, was that the gun used? It was an Italian Manliscia Carcano rifle. And yet the first policeman that went to the scene of the shooting on the day claimed that it was a Mauser rifle that they found. It's doubtful whether he could have fired as many shots as accurately and as quickly as he did with that rifle. It wasn't a particularly good rifle. And there again, you start to come to the arguments of, well, did he fire some of the shots? Did he fire any of the shots? And was he a good enough marksman anyway to have done the damage that he did?
But diving deeper, if we are to believe the official account, we are to conform to ideology that makes little sense.
If Oswald was the lone gunman, there are strange oddities to the sequence of events. So we do know that Oswald was in the building that day. He was seen happily drinking Coke at about 12:15. Now, the assassination occurred at 12:30. But what's of note is that it was expected that the parade would go past at 12:15. Now, unless somebody had managed to tip Oswald off that it had been delayed, and it was delayed because they stopped to talk to more people than had been expected, you would have expected that Oswald would have been in place at 12:15, rather than nonchalantly drinking Coke and just wandering around. You would think he'd want to be in place, and he wasn't. And somehow seemed to know that the parade would be there at 12:30, so that's an oddity. And then after the shooting, he doesn't make a quick attempt to leave the building. Now, some believe he was only a decoy all along, that he didn't fire any shots, or if he did, he was mainly the decoy, the one that people hoped would be found and would then take the blame. Others believe that actually the original idea was to kill Oswald very quickly anyway. But it does seem strange that he didn't make an attempt to immediately leave the building. He was seen again calmly drinking, and a police officer came in, because by now, of course, they were searching the building. He did confront Oswald, but a man with him working there said, no, he's fine, he's one of our employees, ignore him. And then Oswald quietly left the building. But then you have the strangeness that Oswald went back to his home initially, and then he went out onto the streets, and then by then, a description had gone out of the man that the police were looking for. And it's unclear as to exactly why they thought Oswald suddenly was the killer, but nonetheless, that's the description that went round. Police officer Tippett saw Oswald from his patrol car and called Oswald, came out of the car to question him, and we are told Oswald suddenly shot him at point-blank range and then ran away. But even that is unclear, because some of the witnesses to that say there were 2 men involved with the shooting, but that's when Oswald then ran away, having shot the police officer, and then managed to find his way into a cinema. And somebody saw him go in, he was followed, the police arrived, they surrounded the cinema. Interestingly, Oswald seems to have had an intimation that actually the police might have wanted to have killed him very, very quickly, which would, of course, have been more convenient for a lot of people. And there had already been a spate in that time period of police shooting people dead very quickly and then saying they were resisting arrest. And Oswald was quite canny. I think he suspected that, because in the cinema, when they finally surrounded him, he shouted very loudly, "I am not resisting arrest, I am not resisting arrest," which meant, had they shot him dead at that point, they could have said, well, he wasn't resisting arrest. He said he wasn't. He shouted that to the people in the cinema. They heard that. So he was almost protecting himself there by doing that, just to make sure they couldn't take him out then and there. But there are many strange anomalies. What Oswald said when he was taken to the police station, we've seen the vaguest notes. There are no proper transcripts of what he said. In the brief sort of interviews that we heard to the media, he said, "I am just a patsy. I did not kill Kennedy." But the transcripts you would have thought would have existed from those interviews, thus far never been released. So I think there are many doubts as to whether he was really the main gunman, even if he fired some of the shots. You know, I think it's very clear that there is another story there to be told.
Almost 13 years after his death, President Kennedy is on the front cover of a major American magazine. Evidence of a sudden upsurge of interest in the facts surrounding his assassination. A steady stream of articles and reports deal with the subject. At least 2 major television reports are in the making. And this man, Mark Lane, the lawyer who for 12 years now has been asking for a fresh inquiry, suddenly finds himself in demand for his $2,000 a time lecture. He's always claimed that 5 bullets were fired, at least 2 of which came from the front, which means at least 2 gunmen and therefore a conspiracy. The Warren Commission said 1 assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, fired 3 times, 1 miss, 1 which blew off the top of the president's head, and 1 which not only gave the president 2 wounds, but hit Governor John Connally as well. Lane calls the Warren Commission version of that shot their magic bullet theory.
Magic bullet theory. This is the way it works. Here's Lee Harvey Oswald up on the 6th floor of the book depository building. And here comes the president's limousine. As you see, right in front of the building, almost parks under Oswald's window. At this point, Oswald could take his rifle and drop it out the window, confident that he will hit somebody in that limousine. But does he? Does he fire? Oh, no. Being somewhat of a sport, Oswald waits until the car speeds into the distance. And then Oswald fires the first shot, and the bullet hits the president in the back of the neck, leaving behind a hole in his jacket 6 inches below his shoulder. Leaving behind a hole in his shirt 6 inches below his shoulder, and leaving behind a hole in his back 6 inches below the shoulder. The bullet then exits from the president's throat, leaving behind a small lead wound of entrance.
That is not new, but this is the public showings of the famous Zapruder film, once the exclusive property of Time Life magazines, but since a copy was stolen, copied, and widely distributed. Lane and many others say that the direction of the white material from the president's head, the second shot since the first is obscured on the film, proves he was shot from the front. For the first time, the film has been available for long and detailed inspection by lots of people, many of whom now doubt the official Warren Commission finding that the shot came from the rear and that the president's head jerking back is a massive neurological reaction. There was, they say, a conspiracy.
Later analysis of the Zapruder film has shown there to be insufficient time to fire 2 shots in the small time frame available. If the magic bullet theory isn't true, the only explanation is that there was more than 1 assassin. Furthermore, key evidence from the day of the assassination has gone missing. Allegedly, 1 film from an opposite angle, pertaining to show the moment Kennedy was shot, has not been seen since the House Select Committee on Assassinations viewed it in 1978. Set up to investigate the CIA cover-up and Martin Luther King's death, its disappearance and the committee's conclusion has added weight to theories that the official story was wrong. Evidence points to more than 1 gunman being involved.
Now, the autopsy, supported ultimately the final Warren Commission's verdict that it was a shot only from behind. But there are many doubts about the autopsy photographs. Some believe that between the body of the president being taken to Parkland Hospital and then to where the autopsy took place, that the body was actually tampered with to conceal the evidence that the shot came from behind. So we know, for instance, that there was a shot that went through Kennedy's neck and exited here. But of course, was it an exit wound? Or was it a bullet actually coming in again from the front? Some people believe they redressed the wounds to make it look like ultimately the shots had come from the other way around. So there are doubts as to whether some of the photographs we see are even showing Kennedy's head in its damaged state. But some say, well, it was Kennedy's head, but they'd basically pushed it around to make it look like the shot had come from behind and not from the front. But the minute that you say there's even the possibility that that shot might have come from the front, then you have to say there were other gunmen. And that's when you get into the whole realm of wondering, well, who were they? Where were they standing? And then you start to come to the evidence from some of the witnesses on the day who claimed they heard shots coming from the famous grassy knoll, which is a raised area of grass in Dealey Plaza, where the shooting took place with a fence. And many believe that one of the shooters at least, and there are arguments about how many extra shooters there were, but that one of them was standing behind that fence. And that would make sense from what we see in the film. It would be very likely that one of the shots would have been fired from that place. It looks like there's a strong possibility that the shot came from the front.
November 24th, 1963. 2 days on from the assassination, another loud bang sent the case into chaos.
We are told, though, that he was so, outraged by what Oswald had done that he just wanted to take revenge on behalf of the American people and managed somehow to gain access to the back of the police station just as Oswald was being taken out and literally shot him in the abdomen at point-blank range.
The fatal gunshot wound ended Oswald's life, and along with it, his testimony. From there, the investigation aimed its sights on the perpetrator, Jack Ruby.
Ruby owned a nightclub, it was a strip club, it was a sleazy world. He was connected to the mob. The story at the time was he was just doing it, because of his own personal motivations. And that then, of course, raised concerns because some wondered, was that it? Or was he removing Oswald because somebody didn't want Oswald's testimony to be heard? Now, it soon became clear that in fact Ruby had a lot of influence in the community. He certainly would have known people that might have enabled him to get to that part of the police station where the average person wouldn't have got inside of. And also, you then get the strangeness that follows when Ruby, as he is now in jail, begins to make statements. And perhaps Ruby had been told, if you do this, you'll do your time, but then you'll be a big hero, everyone will love you, you'll be very rich, and you can, write your story about it. But that it became clear, once he was in captivity, that he wasn't going to be released. And he then started to make statements. There's a famous press conference that he actually holds in the jail, where he begins to drop hints that there was a wider conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and that he knew more than he was letting on. He was convicted for the killing of Oswald, but he then appealed, and it was going to go to a second trial. And that's when he began to get louder in his claims that there was something strange going on, and he believed that he also would be perhaps murdered. He was being given injections in the jail, and he didn't know what they were. He wasn't a well man. Ruby had cancer, but he believed that perhaps they were trying to poison him to kill him. And sure enough, he then died in the police cells before he got to the second trial. Perhaps information that would have come out at that second trial, that never came out. But it turns out from other witnesses that perhaps Oswald and Ruby were much closer than we knew. Now, there was a lady called Rose Chirami. She worked at the strip club. She was a heroin addict, and by that point in her life was in a bit of a sad state. But interestingly, she had been picked up by the police a few days before the shooting of Kennedy. She, in her babbling, had said that she was aware of a plot to kill Kennedy, and that Ruby and Oswald were working together. She had seen them. She believed that they may have been having a sexual relationship together. She believed that she'd seen other people hanging around that may have been from the intelligence services, which of course then paints a completely different picture, because that would then suggest that Ruby and Oswald knew each other, almost certainly then would have both been part of the plot to kill Kennedy, and that Ruby's killing of Oswald was a way of stopping Oswald ever testifying. And then that's made even stranger by the fact that shortly after, all of this came to light and Ruby began to make his statements, Rose Shirami herself was then found dead, apparently hit by a car lying by the side of a road. So you've then got the beginning of this succession of people who are dying in strange circumstances. And it begins to look like to some that, witnesses are being taken out one by one. The layers get deeper and deeper, and of course, the conspiracy theories grow ever more complex, and yet perhaps justifiably so.
In the end, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 believed that the evidence pointed towards the assassination being a conspiracy. Nevertheless, they were unable to identify the extent of it.
In historical conspiracies that actually look likely that there was a conspiracy going on, you will often find one pattern to look for are witnesses who were there on the day who die strangely, either in mysterious circumstances or die very early in their lives. And there's quite a long roll call of people that were at Dealey Plaza who had testimony that went against the lone gunman theory that did die in, again, mysterious circumstances. Now, you can make a list of anybody and come up with interesting theories when you look at how they died. But with the Kennedy assassination, it does begin to look like there is a pattern. So, number one, Oswald, Ruby, Rose Shirami, so you've got the obvious ones. But then you have some of the other witnesses who, especially the people that heard shots coming from places they shouldn't have been coming from. It could be coincidence, but perhaps not. And there's a number of other conspiracy areas where you do see people falling away, perhaps mysteriously early. And, I don't think it can be ruled out that forces willing to commit murder to get their way would not stop at the first person they murder, but do anything they need to do to cover their tracks. So it cannot be ruled out.
With no definitive conclusion to the assassination, many started pointing fingers towards a notable figure in the White House.
What Kennedy knew about a growing plan to get rid of him is uncertain. He certainly would have known that he had enemies. And this is one of the things that by the time that Kennedy was shot, there were factions queuing up that would have been very happy to have seen the end of John F. Kennedy and his reign. Whether Kennedy knew of an actual plot, I think is perhaps doubtful. Certainly if he knew of the events of what was going to happen that day, I don't think he would have driven or been driven in an open-top car. But certainly, yes, he knew he had enemies. But how much he knew, how much the people around him knew is, of course, another story. One of the fingers that is often pointed is at Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon was a bitter man. Always second best. He never reached the heights of adoration that Kennedy received. He didn't have the same charisma. So you ask yourself, who would benefit most from the death of the president? Hoover and Johnson.
He very quickly attempted to move on from the Kennedy years. He reversed some of Kennedy's policies very quickly. Kennedy had initially supported action in Vietnam, for instance, to help the South Vietnamese, fight off the North Vietnamese communist forces. But Kennedy had begun to make it clear that he didn't think that was ever going to work. There was talk that he was going to withdraw US forces from there. Johnson didn't agree with that at all. So as soon as Kennedy was gone, Johnson actually reversed that and was by and large responsible for the main surge of US action in Vietnam, thus setting, the course for a lot of horror, which would then follow. Johnson has even been accused of giving orders for murder in his earlier years. Now, his family, as you would imagine, deny all of this, we should add. But certainly he had a past where he would, I think, not have been above ruthless actions. And after Kennedy, he was a far more ruthless president. Some people have wondered, did Johnson also play a role in setting this up?
One witness testimony which seemed to link many of the dots is the alleged mistress of Lyndon Johnson.
Johnson's mistress, a lady called Madeline Brown, she is on record as saying that she had heard Johnson saying to her that, effectively implying that he was part of a plot to kill Kennedy. Now, some cast doubt on the statement she made, but it's strange that she would say that. She certainly, believed that Johnson had been involved.
According to Miss Brown, Johnson had underestimated Kennedy in the 1960 election, believing he should be the rightful president. His fall from Senate Majority Leader to powerless vice president intensified his animosity. Her account implicates a group of senators, government officials, and organized crime syndicates from Texas and Washington. Motives were there. Rumors that Johnson would be dropped from Kennedy's ticket in the next election began to circulate, potentially dropping Johnson further down the ladder. Additionally, Brown goes on to state that investigations into Johnson's apparent bribery scheme were ongoing, the conclusion of which may have put Johnson behind bars. Her testimony bases itself at a party the day before the fateful shot rang out. In a secluded area of Texas, in the grounds of oil magnate and political operative Clint Murchison Sr. Brown observed what she believed to be the meeting that ended John Kennedy's life. Rumor has it, the party was attended by many of the elites, from Hoover to Johnson, even Nixon, hitman Mac Wallace to end guy Jack Ruby, as well as the heads of crime syndicates. Brown recollects a statement from that day. As the men exited the meeting, Johnson turned to her and said, "After tomorrow, those SOBs won't embarrass me again." That's no threat. That's a promise.
Johnson has been accused by his detractors of having been involved with corruption in the years before he was vice president. And indeed, he has been accused by some of having murders taken place by hiring the hitman Mac Wallace. And some have accused Mac Wallace of being one of the gunmen who was, also present trying to take out Kennedy, one of the extra gunmen on top of Oswald. So, the Johnson connection is something that's grown over the years. And certainly, I don't believe Kennedy would have thought that Johnson would have taken him out, but he would have certainly known that Johnson wasn't happy.
His actions after assuming office of President of the United States added weight to the claims it was a political crime for political power. Johnson intensified America's involvement in the Southeast Asia, pleasing many of Kennedy's adversaries. But Johnson's first issue was to investigate his impending corruption indictment. Was the assassination the only way out for Johnson? Had he not, Kennedy was ready to remove him from the ticket, decimating his career in the process. Without the presidency, Johnson would have not had the power to end the investigation before incriminating evidence on his involvement in the corruption scandal was made public.
Now, that doesn't prove he was a murderer, but nonetheless, it's clear Johnson would have benefited from the removal of Kennedy and, of course, then did indeed become president. So, that's where you are then saying, well, this is a very high-level conspiracy. You would have needed to have set that up with, at the very least, the compliancy of intelligence agencies and whether they played a hands-on role of making this happen or just stood back knowing there were other people already plotting to kill Kennedy, knowing of maybe when and where that might happen, and just think, we'll just help it along and then stand back. That, of course, is one of the great debates. If we say that the intelligence services were involved in the killing of Kennedy, then we are effectively saying this was a coup d'etat. And certainly the accusations that Johnson was involved would very much make that a coup d'etat. The problem with that, and here are the ramifications for the future, are that if you have, history changed by such an event, you can be very sure they've tried to do that since, albeit not quite so obviously. And there are big conspiracy theories since involving everything from 9/11 to various world events that believe that we see this kind of thing actually quite often. And again, the world is persuaded they are merely mad conspiracy theories. But I think the evidence is fairly strong that at the very least there was knowledge on the part of the intelligence services with the killing of Kennedy. And therefore we have to say that we have forever been in their clutches in the years since. And sadly, until somebody comes along that really is willing to shake that world up, we'll probably go on for a good while longer.
Over the decades, efforts to determine what happened have left more questions than answers. The world changed that day, on November 22nd, 1963. With all the evidence, investigations, re-investigations, witness silencing, motives, and testimonies, it's difficult to believe one lone wolf, Lee Harvey Oswald, organized the assassination.
There are periodically releases of government papers, and we had some just a few years ago that certainly did release a lot of new information. What I found interesting, though, was that the media were given the impression, or they gave the impression, that there wasn't really any new material there. It was just more detail on what we knew. But that actually wasn't true. And there were things like minutes of meetings or speeches that had been recorded at the time that made it very clear that even a few weeks after the shooting, people knew that there was more than one gunman. And that's important. Because, at the time, you might think everybody thought it was a lone gunman. But when you look at some of the papers written back then, many people knew very quickly that that wasn't the case. There are more papers to come out, and perhaps we will learn more. But of course, ultimately, if you are the kind of shadowy intelligence service that still, even more than 50 years on, doesn't want the world to know what your part might have been in that, you are going to find a way not to release that document. You might say you've released all the documents, but will they be? Or will they be forever redacted? Or, you will just never hear about them. I think we can be very sure that we will never see all the real documents. And we will be told, I'm sure, we've got all the real documents, but that's classic conspiracy thinking.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy lies in Arlington National Cemetery, where an eternal flame burns. As the beacon of hope for the future was snuffed out that day, the eternal flame continues to illuminate. The glow from that fire can truly light the world.